Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Sydney haunted house. Imagine the city of Sydney, not as the bustling metropolis of glass and steel we know today, but as a place where the edges of the map were still being carved into the wild Australian bush. We are traveling to the suburb of Annandale, a place where the streets are wide and the air feels heavy with the scent of salt from the nearby harbor. In the quiet hours of the night, when the light of the moon catches the silver surface of Roselle Bay, a silhouette rises above the tree line. It is a structure of stone and shadow, a monument to a love that never arrived and a vision that refused to fade. The year was 1881. At this time, the world was moving with a different rhythm. There was no hum of electricity, only the soft, flickering orange glow of gas lamps and the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones. In the heart of this era, a man named John Young looked upon a ridge of land and saw a kingdom. He was a master builder, a man whose hands had shaped the very soul of Sydney through the rising walls of St. Mary's Cathedral. But here, on Johnston Street, he wanted something different. He began the construction of a row of homes that would later be whispered about as the witches' houses. Among them, the crown jewel was the Abbey. It was not merely a house. It was an act of architectural defiance, a sprawling Gothic revival mansion that seemed to have been plucked from the misty highlands of Scotland and dropped onto the sun-scorched earth of New South Wales. John Young was a man of immense ambition and quiet mysteries. As the principal builder of the cathedral, he moved in circles of high society and secret masonry. It is said that as the abbey rose from the ground, Young brought more than just stone to the site. Folklore suggests that the very gargoyles that peer down from the heights of the mansion were intended for the cathedral itself. Stolen spirits of stone, repurposed to guard a private sanctuary. Each block of sandstone was hewn with precision, a heavy, porous material that seems to breathe with the humidity of the coast. If you were to run your hand over the exterior today, you would feel the grit of over 100 years of history, the way the stone has softened at the edges but retained its cold, imposing weight. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of 50 rooms. Imagine the silence of such a space during its construction in 1881. The sound of a chisel against stone echoing through empty hallways that were destined to hold secrets. Young spared no expense, incorporating reinforced concrete, a technological marvel of the time, and intricate timber architraves that spiraled toward the high ceilings. There were Gothic vaults and hand-painted panels, motifs of owls and cockatoos that seemed to watch the workmen as they moved through the dust. The copper-clad tower reached for the sky, a beacon that was meant to be seen from afar. It was a house built for a queen, yet it felt more like a fortress, a place where the walls were thick enough to drown out the world outside. The motivation for such a grand undertaking was rooted in a deep, perhaps desperate, romance. John Young built the abbey as a lure. His wife, Eleanor, remained in the United Kingdom, and he hoped that by creating a manor of such breathtaking beauty and familiarity, she would finally join him in this new, rugged land. He envisioned her walking through the cloisters, her dress brushing against the tessellated tiles, her voice filling the vast ballroom. But the tragedy of the abbey began before the mortar was even dry. Eleanor never came. Some stories say she died on the long voyage across the ocean, while others suggest she simply could not bear the thought of leaving her home for a wild colony. The house that was meant to be a sanctuary for a family became a hollow shell, a monument to a longing that would never be satisfied. Because of this, John Young never truly lived within the walls of his masterpiece. He resided in a smaller house nearby, leaving the abbey to be tended by housekeepers and shadows. The 50 rooms remained mostly dark, the air within them becoming still and heavy. It is in this stillness that the legends began to take root. People passing by in the late 19th century would look up at the tower and see a flicker of white, a figure standing by the window, looking out toward the sea, waiting for a ship that would never dock. The abbey was born of stone and sorrow, and as we move deeper into its history, we will find that the shadows it cast in 1881 have never truly lifted. For now, let the image of that lonely sandstone tower rest in your mind, a silent sentinel in the Sydney night. The year was 1881. The ridge above Roselle Bay was thick with the scent of salt and the constant sound of iron meeting stone. John Young had a vision of a grand garden suburb, but at its heart, he was carving a monument of unrequited hope. The abbey was not just a house. It was a labyrinth of Piedmont sandstone, rising block by heavy block under the relentless Australian sun. Each stone was a piece of the earth, ancient and cold, dragged from the quarries to form the jagged teeth of the Gothic towers. The workers moved with a heavy, deliberate rhythm, their faces coated in the fine, white dust of the masonry. It was a time of immense physical toil, where the strength of a man's back was the only thing standing between the progress of industry and the void of the unknown. Among these men was a stonemason, a craftsman whose name has been largely swallowed by the decades, but whose presence remains etched into the very foundation of the building. Picture him high up on the scaffolding, where the wind from the bay whipped through the wooden beams. He was working on the great tower, the piece of the house that would eventually house the gargoyles and the narrow, arched windows. The height was dizzying. Below him, the ground was a patchwork of red earth and construction debris. He was focused on a single joint, the precision of his chisel a point of pride. But there is a fragility to such heights, a thin line between the mastery of stone and the surrender to gravity. One momentary lapse was all it took for the stone to reclaim its terrible weight. The tragedy, when it came, was said to be sudden and silent. A foot slipped on a patch of loose mortar, or perhaps the wind caught him at an unguarded moment. There was no grand outcry, only the sickening rush of air and the heavy thud of a body meeting the unyielding ground. The work on the ridge came to a sudden, jarring halt. The rhythmic clinking of tools died away, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence that seemed to vibrate through the unfinished walls. His blood seeped into the porous sandstone of the foundation, a dark, permanent stain that no amount of scrubbing could truly erase. It was the first offering of life to a house that was intended to be a sanctuary of love. The earth took him in, and the house began to feel heavier than before. In the days that followed, a shadow seemed to settle over the site. The workers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the height of the tower where their comrade had fallen. They began to notice things. A tool that was left on a heavy oak bench would be found several feet away the next morning. The temperature in the lower cellars, even in the height of the humid summer, would drop until one could see their own breath in the stagnant air. They spoke of a heaviness in the chest when walking through the half-finished ballroom, as if the air itself were mourning a guest who would never arrive. These were the first seeds of the superstition that would grow to define the abbey. It felt as if the stone had a memory of a sudden, violent end. John Young, ever the master builder, pushed the project forward with a singular focus. He was a man of logic and Freemasonry, obsessed with the symbols of the craft that he carved into the lintels and the gables. He saw the accident as a regrettable delay, a cost of progress in a harsh land. But the local residents of Annandale, watching the spires rise like witches' hats against the gray sky, saw something else. They saw a house that was being built on a foundation of grief. Before the roof was even finished, before the first piece of stained glass was set into its leaden frame, the neighbors began to avoid the perimeter. They claimed they could hear the sound of a phantom chisel hitting stone late at night, a rhythmic tapping that came from the empty, shadowed heights of the tower. This was the beginning of the house's life, not as a home, but as a vessel for the discarded. The stonemason's death was the first chapter in a long history of departures. It set a tone of isolation and tragedy that seemed to repel the living and attract the restless. As the walls grew taller, the sense of unease only deepened. The gargoyles, with their stone eyes and twisted mouths, seemed to be watching for the next stumble. The abbey was becoming a monument to the things that go wrong when we try to build heaven on earth. It was a masterpiece, certainly, but it was a masterpiece that demanded a price. And that price had been paid in blood before the first door was ever locked or the first candle lit. The foundation was set, and the shadows were already beginning to move. The year was 1892, and the sun was dipping low behind the jagged horizon of the MacArthur region, casting long, bruised shadows across the freshly manicured lawns of the grand estate. The young family arrived with the kind of hope that only new wealth and a clean slate can provide. As the carriage wheels crunched over the pristine white gravel, the rhythmic sound was like a heartbeat, steady and full of life. They looked up at the towering sandstone walls, the stone still smelling faintly of the quarry and the sweat of the men who had shaped it. For the young family, this was not just a house. It was the physical manifestation of their dreams. The father, a man of industry with eyes that always searched the distance, believed he had built a fortress against the world. He did not see the way the light seemed to die as it crossed the threshold of the front door, nor did he notice the silence that waited for them inside, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar oil and expensive wax. The grand staircase spiraled upward into the darkness of the upper floors, its banister polished to a mirror shine that reflected only the flickering yellow glow of their handheld lamps. As the family moved from room to room, their footsteps echoed with a hollow, metallic ring against the polished floorboards. You can imagine them, can you not? The mother trailing her fingers along the heavy velvet curtains, the children's laughter bubbling up through the atrium, and the father standing in his new study, surrounded by the smell of leather-bound books and ink. But even in those first hours, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The temperature in the hallway would drop suddenly, a pocket of winter air trapped in the middle of a summer evening. The heavy oak doors, balanced perfectly by the master craftsmen, began to swing shut with a soft, decisive click, even when there was no breeze to guide them. It was as if the house was testing its new inhabitants, tasting their presence with every creak of the joists. By the third month of their residency, the novelty of the dream home had begun to sour into something much more opaque. The servants were the first to whisper. They spoke of the cellar, that damp, stone-lined cavern where the air felt like wet wool against the skin. They claimed that when they went down to fetch the preserves or the wine, they could hear the sound of soft, wet footsteps following them, not the crisp click of a leather boot, but the slapping sound of bare, cold feet on the flagstones. One maid refused to enter the kitchen after dark, swearing that the heavy iron pots would sway on their hooks as she passed, a rhythmic clanging that sounded like a funeral bell. The young family tried to ignore these tailies, dismissing them as the superstitions of the uneducated, but the father found himself sitting up late into the night, a single candle burning low on his desk. He would listen to the scratching behind the wainscoting, a sound too deliberate to be rats, and feel a prickle of ice at the base of his neck, as if someone were standing just behind his chair, reading over his shoulder with invisible eyes. The children were the most affected by the house's growing restlessness. Their nursery was located on the second floor, a room flooded with sunlight during the day, but consumed by a predatory gloom at night. They began to speak of a man who stood in the corner near the wardrobe, a man with gray skin and eyes like dusty glass. They called him the Gray Man, and they said he never spoke. He only watched them sleep with a heavy, sorrowful intensity. When the mother went to comfort them, she found the room so cold that her own breath turned to mist in the air, despite the fireplace being stoked with burning coals. She would pull the blankets up to their chins, her hands trembling as she felt the weight of a gaze she could not see. The rumors in the local town began to swell like a rising tide. People spoke of the stonemason who had fallen during the construction, his blood seeping into the very foundations they now slept upon. They said the house was not a home at all, but a beautiful trap designed to catch the living and hold them close to the dead. The end came on a Tuesday in late November, 1895. There was no single, dramatic event, but rather a final, suffocating realization that they were no longer welcome in their own home. A neighbor later reported seeing the family carriage depart in the middle of the night, the horses driven at a frantic, dangerous pace. When the local authorities eventually entered the house weeks later, they found a scene frozen in time. The dining table was set for a meal that was never eaten. The silver cutlery was tarnished, and the fine china plates were covered in a thick layer of gray dust. In the center of the table, a roast chicken had rotted into a skeletal remains, surrounded by the shriveled husks of vegetables. It was as if the family had stood up from their chairs and simply run for their lives, leaving behind their clothes, their heirlooms, and the very identity they had worked so hard to build. The young family was never seen in Sydney again, disappearing into the vastness of the outback or perhaps fleeing back across the sea, leaving only their names and a legacy of terror etched into the sandstone walls. For years afterward, the house stood empty, a hollow monument to a dream that had turned to ash. The windows, once bright with the reflection of the harbor, became clouded and dark, like cataracts over the eyes of a dying giant. Locals would walk on the opposite side of the street, their voices dropping to hushed tones as they passed the rusted iron gates. They whispered about the lights that would occasionally flicker in the upper windows, despite the gas lines being long since disconnected. They spoke of the shadow that still stood on the balcony, looking out over the water as if waiting for a carriage that would never return. The residency of the young family had been brief, less than 4 years in total, but the mark they left was permanent. They had opened a door that could not be shut, and in their haste to escape, they had left the house hungry for the next soul brave enough to step across the threshold. The dream home had become a nightmare, and the silence inside was no longer a held breath. It was a low, steady hum of anticipation, waiting for the shadows to move once more. The 1920s arrived at the gates of the great house not with a roar, but with the dry, rhythmic rasp of a crosscut saw biting into seasoned timber. For years, the mansion had stood as a silent sentinel on the ridge, its sandstone skin absorbing the salt air and the quiet judgment of the passing neighbors. But as the new decade unfolded, the city of Sydney began to press inward, hungry for space and desperate for shelter in the wake of the Great War. The era of the grand family estate was crumbling, giving way to a more fractured, frantic way of life. It was during these early years that the house underwent its most profound and painful transformation. A team of workmen, clad in heavy canvas and carrying the scent of tobacco and fresh pine, breached the threshold that had been locked for so long. They did not come to restore the old glory of the original builder, but to dismantle the very idea of a single home. They brought with them bundles of cheap lath, bags of gritty plaster, and the heavy, echoing finality of the hammer. The process was known among the locals as dividing the stone. It was an architectural surgery that ignored the soul of the building. The grand ballroom, once designed for the sweeping skirts of the elite and the soft glow of gaslight, was the first to fall. Imagine the scene through a haze of golden dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. The workmen erected thin, skeletal partitions of wood, carving the vast, echoing space into 5 narrow, claustrophobic cells. Each new wall was a scar across the history of the room. The ornate cornices, crafted with such delicate care decades prior, were now abruptly cut off by the raw edge of a plywood ceiling. A fireplace that had once warmed a room of 30 people now found itself trapped behind a new partition, its marble hearth split between 2 different lives, belonging to neither. The house began to smell differently then. The scent of ancient dust and cold stone was replaced by the sharp tang of turpentine, the sweetness of fresh sawdust, and the lingering, metallic odor of iron nails being driven into the heart of the structure. By the year 1924, the transformation was complete. The Sydney haunted house, as the children had begun to whisper in the streets, was no longer a monument to one man's ambition. It had become a hive. Where once a single set of footsteps might have echoed down the grand staircase, there were now dozens. The staircase itself, with its banisters of polished cedar, felt the weight of many different worlds. To divide the house was to invite a strange, discordant energy into its halls. These were boarding flats, small and cramped, where a single gas ring served as a kitchen and a wash basin in the corner served as a bath. The tenants who moved in were as diverse as the shadows that clung to the high ceilings. There were young couples, their faces etched with the strain of making ends meet in a city that was growing too fast. There were elderly bachelors who spent their days in silence, their rooms filled with the ghosts of a world that existed before the war. Each person brought a sliver of their own history, a fragment of their own grief, and tucked it into the corners of the divided stone. Among the first to take up residence in the upper northern flat was a woman named Margaret, a seamstress who had lost her husband at the Somme. She would sit by the window that overlooked the bay, the light catching the silver of her needle as she worked late into the night. Her presence was quiet, almost ghost-like, but she often spoke of a peculiar feeling in the floorboards beneath her chair. She described it not as a sound, but as a vibration, as if the house itself were breathing heavily, struggling under the weight of so many partitioned lives. Below her, in what had once been the library, lived a clerk named Thomas. He was a man of precise habits who kept his ledgers stacked in perfect towers. Yet, he frequently complained to the new landlord about the sound of water dripping behind the walls, a rhythmic tapping that occurred even when the skies were clear and the pipes were dry. The workmen had been efficient in their division, but they could not silence the way the house communicated across the new boundaries. A cough in the basement could be heard as a sigh in the attic. A door closing in the east wing felt like a heartbeat in the west. The atmosphere of the house shifted as the 1920s progressed. The air became thick with the domestic sounds of shared existence. The clink of spoons against porcelain, the muffled arguments of a couple 3 doors down, and the smell of boiled cabbage drifting through the drafty corridors. But beneath the mundane reality of the boarding house, a deeper mystery remained. The tenants rarely spoke to one another in the narrow hallways. They moved like ships in the night, avoiding eye contact as they hurried toward their private sanctuaries. It was as if they all sensed that they were intruders in a space that had never intended to hold them. The architectural changes had created strange pockets of dead air and blind corners. In the process of dividing the stone, the workmen had inadvertently created a labyrinth. One could walk from the front door to the back without ever seeing the sun, passing through a series of dimly lit passages where the wallpaper was already beginning to peel, revealing the cold, indifferent sandstone underneath. The house was no longer a home. It was a collection of secrets, held together by nothing more than gravity and the memory of what it used to be. As the sun set over Sydney during those long summer evenings of the mid-20s, the house would settle with a series of groans that sounded almost like human speech. The weight of the new walls, the pressure of the added floors, and the constant movement of the tenants caused the ancient foundation to shift. Some said the house was rejecting its new purpose. Others believed that by breaking the large rooms into small ones, the owners had fractured the very spirit of the place. They had taken a grand narrative and turned it into a series of short, disjointed stories. The children in the neighborhood still kept their distance, watching from the sidewalk as the lights flickered on in dozens of different windows at once. To them, the house looked like a giant with 100 eyes, each one staring out into the darkness with a different expression. The era of the boarding flats had begun, and with it, the legend of the Sydney haunted house grew deeper, more complex, and far more unsettling. The stone had been divided, but the silence that lived within it remained whole, waiting for the next change in the wind. The year was 1924, a time when Sydney was caught between the rough-edged shadows of its colonial past and the shimmering, uncertain promise of the modern age. In the height of that sweltering January, the house on the hill seemed to draw the heat into its very bones, the timber expanding with rhythmic, heavy thuds that sounded like a heart beating beneath the floorboards. It was during this thick, airless summer that the mystery of the tenant first took root. He was a man of quiet habits, a teller of few stories who had rented the upper corner room for less than 3 months. His name, recorded in the ledger as Arthur Penhaligon, was written in a script so precise it looked more like an etching than a signature. He would leave for work at 8 in the morning and return as the clock struck 6, his footsteps a reliable metronome for the other residents who lived in the rooms below. Until one Tuesday, the metronome simply stopped. For 3 days, the silence from the upper floor was absolute. It was not the silence of a man sleeping late or reading quietly. It was a heavy, pressurized void that seemed to leak out from under his door and spill down the staircase. The landlord, a stout man named Mr. Gable, eventually found himself standing before that door on a Friday morning, his hand trembling slightly as he raised it to knock. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the narrow gaps in the window frames and the distant, muffled clang of a tram on the street below. When the door refused to budge, even with the master key, Mr. Gable felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the summer heat. He called for the authorities, and 2 officers from the local precinct arrived, their boots clattering with a sound that felt far too loud for the sanctity of that quiet hallway. They had to put their shoulders to the wood, the frame splintering with a sharp, agonizing crack that echoed through the entire house. When the door finally gave way, the detectives did not find the scene of a struggle they had expected. Instead, they found a room that appeared to be frozen in a single, unremarkable heartbeat. The air inside was still and tasted faintly of cedar and old paper. The bed was made with military precision, the white linens pulled so taut that a coin would have bounced off the surface. There was no sign of Arthur Penhaligon. No clothes were missing from the wardrobe. His 2 wool suits hung like hollowed-out versions of himself, and his single pair of polished dress shoes sat neatly side by side beneath a mahogany chair. On the small bedside table sat a cup of black tea. The porcelain was cold to the touch, and a thin, dark film had formed over the surface of the liquid, but the silver spoon still rested in the saucer as if it had only just been placed there. Beside the tea lay an open book, a collection of poetry by William Blake. Its pages turned to a poem about the nature of shadows and the invisible world. The investigation began with a meticulous search for an exit. The room was on the 3rd floor, a sheer drop of 40 feet to the stone courtyard below. The single window was not only closed, but locked from the inside with a heavy brass latch that required a significant amount of force to turn. There were no fire escapes near that side of the building, and no footprints were found in the dust on the exterior ledge. The chimney was far too narrow for a grown man to climb, and yet the door had been bolted from the inside. Detective Miller, a man who had spent 15 years untangling the grim knots of Sydney's underworld, sat on the edge of the tenant's chair and stared at the empty room for 4 hours. He noted the way the afternoon light hit the floorboards, illuminating the fine layer of dust that remained undisturbed. There were no scuff marks, no signs of a hasty departure, and certainly no evidence of a body being moved. It was as if Arthur had simply ceased to be physical, evaporating into the very atmosphere of the house. The police questioned every neighbor within a 3-block radius. Some recalled seeing a light in the window late at night, a soft, flickering amber glow that didn't quite behave like a kerosene lamp. Others spoke of a faint humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls on the night he vanished, a low-frequency drone that made the teeth ache and the dogs in the street howl at the moon. But no one had seen him leave. No one had seen a stranger enter. The investigation eventually turned toward his workplace, only to find that no Arthur Penhaligon had ever been employed at the shipping firm he claimed to serve. The references he had provided to the landlord were for men who did not exist, living at addresses that were nothing but vacant lots and overgrown gardens. The man was a ghost before he ever disappeared, a carefully constructed persona that had taken up residence in a house that seemed all too eager to keep his secrets. Deep in the pockets of one of the suits left in the wardrobe, the detectives found a final, baffling piece of evidence. It was a small, smooth stone, perfectly round and dark as midnight, wrapped in a scrap of silk. When Detective Miller unwrapped it, he found a note written in that same precise, etching-like script. It did not contain a name or a destination. It simply read, "The house has asked, and I have finally answered." By 1925, the case was moved to the archives, marked as an unsolved disappearance with no leads and no suspects. But for the residents who remained, the room was never truly empty. They would hear the sound of a chair scraping across the floor above them at 3 in the morning, or the faint, unmistakable clink of a silver spoon hitting a porcelain saucer. The locked room remained a permanent scar on the history of the house, a place where the walls had grown just a little bit thicker, as if they were slowly digesting the memory of the man who went into the silence and never came back. The small, smooth stone sat heavy in the detective's palm, its surface worn to a glass-like finish by years of nervous friction. It was a physical anchor to a story that seemed to be dissolving into the ether. To understand how such a simple object could be linked to the suits in the wardrobe, we must step back from the dust of the present and look toward the meticulous, ink-stained records of the past. History, especially the kind that haunts us, is rarely found in the grand gestures of the headlines. It lives in the margins, tucked away in the leather-bound ledgers of the local constabulary. In the 1930s, the city of Sydney was a place of transformation and shadow, a city struggling through the weight of the Great Depression, while the skeletal arches of the harbor bridge rose like a steel promise over the water. It was within this atmosphere of uncertainty that the first formal complaints began to trickle into the station, whispers on paper that would eventually scream for attention. The police station at the time was a place of heavy wood and the persistent scent of stale tobacco and wet wool. Outside, the Sydney rain would drum a rhythmic, relentless beat against the corrugated iron roofs, a sound that seemed to drown out the city's anxieties. Inside, a single constable sat behind a desk of dark oak, his nib scratching rhythmically against the grain of the paper. It was October of 1934 when the first entry appeared, a Tuesday night, thick with humidity and the smell of the nearby docks. A woman, her coat buttoned tight against a chill that wasn't entirely atmospheric, sat across from him. She didn't speak of theft or violence, but of something far more unsettling. She spoke of the hall in the house on the hill. She described a sound that defied the logic of the architecture, a soft, dry sibilance that followed her from the front door to the kitchen, always 10 paces behind, like the rustle of a silk dress on a floor that had long since been stripped bare. The constable's pen paused. He was used to the desperation of the era, the crimes born of hunger or anger, but this was different. The woman's eyes were fixed on the flickering gaslight, her hands tracing the same patterns on her lap that the detectives would later find worn into the small stone. She insisted that the whispers were not words, but the memory of words, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the floorboards. She told him that when she stopped, the sound stopped, but the air remained heavy, as if the hallway itself was holding its breath. The officer recorded the complaint under the heading of a public nuisance, a bureaucratic pigeonhole for the unexplainable. He didn't know then that this was merely the first thread in a tapestry of disturbances that would eventually span years. He simply blew on the ink to dry it, the blue script settling into the paper like a secret being buried. As the months of 1935 rolled forward, the ledger grew thicker. The complaints were no longer isolated incidents. A pattern was emerging, one that the constabulary could no longer dismiss as the fancies of the lonely. Another report, filed in the deep winter of that year, spoke of sightings. A delivery man, a person of sturdy character and little imagination, described a figure standing at the far end of the same hallway. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun casting long, golden fingers through the transom window. He described a man in a suit, not a modern cut, but something older, stiffer, standing perfectly still. He said the figure didn't have the blurred edges of a ghost. It was as solid as the wall behind it. But when he blinked, the hall was empty. The only thing remaining was a sudden, sharp drop in temperature and the faint, unmistakable smell of ozone, like the air right before a lightning strike. The man had refused to return to the house, leaving his crate of goods on the sidewalk. These documents, now yellowed and brittle with age, reveal a growing sense of dread within the neighborhood. The local constabulary began to refer to the files as the whispers in the hall cases, a nickname that carried a dark humor to mask their genuine confusion. By 1936, the disturbances had moved beyond the auditory. There were reports of objects being moved, not thrown in anger, but carefully repositioned. A silver tray found in the center of a locked room. A pair of shoes placed neatly at the top of the cellar stairs. It was as if a presence was trying to reassert a sense of order, or perhaps was looking for something it had lost. The detectives in the present day, looking at the stone and the suits, can see the echoes of these movements. Every displacement of dust, every lingering chill in the air of that Sydney house was a step toward the discovery they were about to make. The past was not dead. It was simply waiting for the right person to listen to its hushed, persistent testimony. In the final entries of the 1938 police log, the tone of the reports changes. The skepticism of the officers had vanished, replaced by a weary acceptance. One sergeant wrote of a night spent in the house, a rare attempt to debunk the claims. He described the silence of the hallway as something physical, a weight that pressed against his chest. He didn't see the man in the suit, but he heard the stone. He heard the sound of something small and hard being tapped rhythmically against the wood of the floor, clack, 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 in a sequence of 3. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When he shone his torch down the hall, the beam cut through a thick, unnatural mist that hadn't been there moments before. He left the house before dawn, his report concluding that while no crime had been committed, the residence was unsuitable for habitation due to persistent and unexplained atmospheric phenomena. The house was eventually boarded up, but the whispers didn't stop. They simply waited in the dark, buried in the files, until the detectives opened the wardrobe and found the stone that had been tapping out its message for over 80 years. By the time the mid-1950s arrived, the heavy, humid silence that had settled over the property after the police abandoned their watch in 1938 had begun to feel like a physical weight. Sydney was changing. The post-war era brought a restless energy to the city, a desire to scrub away the shadows of the past and replace them with the clean lines of modernity. The house, however, remained a stubborn relic, its sandstone walls stained by decades of salt air and neglect. It sat perched on its rise, watching the harbor with sightless windows until a group of investors decided it was time to breathe life back into the old carcass. The plan was ambitious, a full-scale renovation to convert the sprawling, irregular mansion into a series of luxury apartments. It was supposed to be a straightforward project, a matter of stripping back the rot and reinforcing the skeleton. But the house, as it had always done, had other plans. It held its breath as the first team of contractors arrived, their heavy boots thumping across the floorboards like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. Imagine the scene in the summer of 1954. The heat in Sydney was oppressive, a thick, golden blanket that made every movement feel sluggish. The foreman, A man named Arthur, who had spent 30 years working on the city's grandest structures, stood in the main foyer with a set of original blueprints spread across a makeshift table. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink fading into ghostly blue lines that traced the intentions of an architect long since dead. Arthur noted the precision of the drawings. Every fireplace, every closet, and every servant's passage was accounted for. Or so it seemed. The workers began their task with the sounds of industry, the rhythmic rasp of saws, the sharp, metallic ring of hammers, and the constant, gritting shuffle of boots on stone. For the first few weeks, the house yielded to their touch. Walls were stripped of their floral wallpaper, revealing the gray, tired plaster beneath. But as they moved deeper into the eastern wing, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew cooler, despite the summer sun, and a strange, metallic scent began to rise from the floorboards. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first anomaly was discovered. A young laborer was tasked with removing a section of wood paneling in a small, windowless corridor that linked the library to the dining hall. As he swung his sledgehammer, the sound that returned wasn't the dull thud of solid brick or the sharp crack of timber. It was a hollow, echoing boom that resonated through the floor, vibrating up into the soles of his feet. He stopped, his brow furrowed with sweat, and tapped the wall again with the handle of his tool. The sound was unmistakable. There was a void behind the lath and plaster. He called Arthur over, and together they compared the physical wall to the blueprints. According to the drawings, this was a solid load-bearing partition, 3 feet thick, separating 2 primary rooms. There should have been nothing but stone and mortar. Intrigued, Arthur ordered the wall to be breached. As the first bricks were pried loose, a gust of air escaped from the opening. It was not the damp, musty smell of a cellar, but something oddly sterile, like the scent of dried lavender and ancient, undisturbed dust. They widened the hole until it was large enough for a man to crawl through. Arthur shone his flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through a haze of floating particulates that danced like tiny ghosts in the light. What he saw defied the logic of the house's layout. Behind the wall sat a perfectly square chamber, barely 6 feet across. It was not a closet or a crawlspace. The walls were finished with the same high-quality plaster as the rest of the mansion, and the floor was laid with fine, dark oak. There were no windows, no doors, and no vents. It was a room designed to be completely inaccessible, a secret pocket of space hummed into existence by an architect who had never recorded its presence on paper. In the center of the room sat a single, high-backed chair made of wrought iron, facing the blank wall. There were no footprints in the thick carpet of dust, suggesting that no one had stepped inside this room for at least 40 years. The isolation was absolute. Arthur felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine, a sensation he couldn't shake even after he stepped back into the sun-drenched corridor. As the renovation continued, more of these secret chambers began to appear. By the end of 1955, the workers had located 4 distinct voids, each tucked away in the corners of the house where the geometry seemed to fold in on itself. One was hidden behind the grand staircase, a narrow, vertical shaft that climbed 3 stories but had no visible entrance or exit. Another was a low-ceilinged room beneath the pantry, reachable only by removing a heavy slab of flagstone that had been mortared into place. The most disturbing discovery, however, was found in the attic. Behind a false back in a cedar wardrobe, the workers found a small, circular room with walls lined entirely with copper sheeting. The copper was tarnished to a deep, bruised purple, and the air inside was strangely heavy, as if the metal was holding onto a static charge. There was no furniture here, only a series of intricate symbols etched into the floor, radiating outward from the center like ripples in a dark pond. The blueprints remained silent on these additions. It was as if a second, shadow house had been built inside the first, a hidden architecture meant for a purpose that the owners never intended to share with the world. The workers became increasingly uneasy. Men who had spent their lives in construction started to report a feeling of being watched from the very walls they were trying to paint. The rhythmic tapping of hammers was often met with a faint, echoing response from deep within the structure, a mimicry that occurred just a second too late to be a natural echo. Arthur noticed that the blueprints, once so clear, now seemed to change. Lines appeared to shift under the flickering light of the work lamps. Doorways seemed to be in places they hadn't been the day before. He began to wonder if the hidden chambers were not just architectural quirks, but organs of a living thing, lungs that breathed a different kind of air. The project slowed to a crawl. The investors grew impatient, demanding to know why the conversion was taking so long. But how could Arthur explain that the house was growing? How could he tell them that for every wall they tore down, they found a new, unexplained space that seemed to swallow the light? The 1950s renovation, once a symbol of Sydney's progress, was becoming a descent into a labyrinth that had no map and no end. The year was 1954, and the grand, Victorian Italianate mansion on the fringes of Sydney stood as a silent, decaying sentinel. Its ornate cast-iron lacework, once a symbol of immense wealth and social standing, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The sprawling estate, known to locals as a place where the air felt several degrees colder than the surrounding valley, had become a magnet for curious teenagers and local vandals. To protect what remained of the cedar joinery and the marble hearths, a series of night watchmen were hired. These were not men prone to flights of fancy. Most were veterans of the Great Wars, men who had seen the harshest realities of the world and carried a certain calloused indifference to the dark. They were paid to sit in the stillness with a heavy torch and a thermos of black tea, ensuring the property remained undisturbed until the morning sun crested the horizon. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, a strange pattern began to emerge. The agency responsible for the property found it increasingly difficult to keep staff. Men who arrived for their first shift with broad shoulders and skeptical smiles would be gone by dawn, leaving their keys on the gatepost and refusing to return for their final pay packet. One such man was Arthur, a retired merchant seaman who took the shift in late October. He described the initial hours of his watch as unremarkable, the kind of heavy, thick silence you only find in buildings that have been hollowed out by time. He sat in the grand entrance hall, his small kerosene heater casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The smell of the house was a mixture of damp earth, old floor wax, and something sharp, like ozone before a thunderstorm. Around 2 a.m, the atmosphere shifted. It was not a sound that alerted him, but a physical sensation, a sudden, crushing weight in the center of his chest. He recounted how the air seemed to thicken, becoming as viscous as water, making every breath a deliberate, labored effort. He shone his torch toward the grand staircase, the beam cutting through the darkness like a physical blade. There, in the pale circle of light, he saw the dust motes swirling in a frantic, localized vortex, as if someone unseen had just brushed past him in a desperate hurry. He heard the distinct, rhythmic click of leather heels on the parquetry floor, moving from the top landing toward the tower room, yet the stairs remained empty. Arthur was not the only one to witness the house's internal life. Another watchman, a younger man named James, reported a night in 1957 that stayed with him for the rest of his days. James had been patrolling the exterior perimeter when he noticed a flickering light in the attic window, a soft, amber glow that shouldn't have been there, given the electricity had been disconnected years prior. Thinking a squatter had broken in, he entered the house, his heavy boots echoing with a lonely, hollow thud. As he climbed the narrow service stairs, the temperature plummeted. His breath began to bloom in white, translucent clouds before his face. When he reached the attic door, he heard a sound that chilled him to his marrow, the soft, unmistakable giggling of a child. It was a playful, innocent sound, yet in the context of the midnight gloom, it felt profoundly wrong. He pushed the door open, expecting to find a runaway, but the room was a void of shadows. Then the giggling stopped, replaced by a wet, heavy thud from the floorboards directly beneath his feet, as if something large and sodden had been dropped from a great height. He did not wait to investigate further. The testimonies gathered by the Historical Society in later years all shared a peculiar detail: the feeling of being watched from within the very walls themselves. The watchmen spoke of eyes that seemed to peer through the cracks in the plaster and ears that listened from the vents. One veteran guard, who lasted only 4 hours of a planned 12-hour shift, claimed that the house was not just a shell of brick and mortar, but a living entity that resented his presence. He described sitting in the kitchen when the heavy, cast-iron stove began to vibrate. It started as a low hum, a subterranean growl that rattled the remaining china in the cupboards. Then the back door, which he had double-bolted himself, swung open with such violence that the hinges groaned in protest. There was no wind that night, not even a breeze to stir the dry leaves on the veranda. As he stood to close it, he felt a hand, icy and firm, grip his wrist. There was no one there, but the red marks on his skin remained for 3 days, shaped like the small, thin fingers of a youth. He walked out of the house and never looked back, leaving his torch behind in the dirt. By the end of the 1950s, the house had earned a reputation that no amount of professional guarding could suppress. The stories of the night shift had moved from the watchmen's barracks to the local pubs, growing in detail and dread. It was whispered that the house held the memories of the boys who had died there, the one who drowned in the dam, and the one who succumbed to illness in the theatrette. Their spirits, it seemed, did not appreciate the intrusion of flickering torches and heavy footfalls. The watchmen were not just protecting the house from the living, they were unknowingly trespassing on the domain of the dead. Each man who quit spoke of a final breaking point, a moment where the logic of the physical world collapsed. For some, it was the sight of a woman in a long, dark gown standing in the tower window, staring out toward the harbor with a grief so profound it could be felt from the driveway. For others, it was the sound of a noose tightening against a beam in the parlor, a creak of rope that repeated every 10 minutes like a morbid clock. They all agreed on one thing: some places are not meant to be guarded by the living. As the mid-century transitioned into the modern era, the property sat in a state of uneasy peace. The night shifts were eventually abandoned, deemed too expensive and too psychologically taxing for the revolving door of employees. The vandals, too, seemed to sense the change, leaving the mansion to the slow, steady reclamation of nature. The vines began to crawl up the sandstone, and the roof tiles slipped away like scales, exposing the rafters to the rain. But even in its dereliction, the house remained active. Passers-by on the road below would often report seeing lights moving behind the boarded-up windows, or hearing the faint, distant sound of a piano playing a melody that had been popular 80 years before. The testimonies of the men who tried to hold the line during those long, dark shifts serve as a bridge between the historical record and the supernatural. They were witnesses to the fact that while the occupants of a house may change or vanish, the house itself never truly forgets. The shadows of the night shift remain etched into the floorboards, waiting for the next person brave enough, or foolish enough, to step inside after the sun goes down. The 1970s descended upon the suburb of Annandale like a heavy, velvet curtain, damp with the salt of the Sydney harbor. The Abbey, that grand and jagged monument of Victorian Gothic ambition, stood at the center of a changing world. While the rest of the city began to pulse with the neon and grit of a new era, the mansion remained draped in its own long shadows. For decades, the local children had whispered of the lady in white who supposedly drifted through the upper corridors, and of the gargoyles that seemed to shift their stony gaze whenever a passerby looked away. But as the decade progressed, the air around the property began to change. It was no longer just the chill of the supernatural that made the neighbors quicken their pace. A different kind of silence had taken root, a silence born of secrets that were far more modern and far more human than any ghost. Inside the walls of the abbey, the transition was visible in the very texture of the rooms. The grand ballroom, once intended for the swirling gowns of the 1900s, had been partitioned into smaller, more functional spaces. The air here was a thick mixture of the old and the new. You could smell the ancient, porous sandstone breathing in the humidity, exhaling a scent of damp earth and moss. But beneath that, there was the sharp, metallic tang of clinical life. In the quiet hours of the night, when the streetlights of Johnston Street flickered against the leaded glass windows, the house did not feel empty. It felt occupied by a purpose that the public did not yet understand. The flickering light in a basement window was not the lantern of a restless spirit, but the steady glow of a man working late into the morning, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the rustle of paper. The mystery was shifting from the ethereal to the material. The investigation did not begin with a roar, but with a series of quiet observations. It was the way certain cars would pull up to the high stone walls in the pre-dawn gray, their engines cut long before they reached the gate. It was the way the heavy timber doors would groan open and shut with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. For the detectives watching from the shadows of the nearby eucalyptus trees, the abbey was no longer a haunted house. It was a puzzle of human logistics. They watched the way the rain-slicked slate roof caught the moonlight, and they waited. The atmosphere was thick with a slow-burning tension, the kind that settles into your bones when you know a storm is coming. Every leaf that skittered across the pavement sounded like a footstep. Every distant siren felt like a personal warning. The police were patient, moving with a deliberate slowness that mirrored the building they were circling. When the authorities finally moved in, they did not find the ectoplasm or the spirits that the ghost hunters of the era had so desperately sought with their flickering machines. Instead, they found the cold, hard evidence of a subterranean world. As they moved through the narrow hallways, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, the sound echoed up into the copper-clad turrets like a heartbeat. The beams of their torches cut through the darkness, illuminating the intricate stencil work on the walls, Masonic symbols and medieval motifs that seemed to mock the intruders. In the hidden corners of the mansion, behind doors that had remained locked for a generation, they discovered the apparatus of an illegal operation. It was a scene of startling contrast. The ornate, hand-carved architraves framing the sterile glass of medical vials and the organized chaos of forbidden files. Human malice was found not in a demonic presence, but in the defiance of the law. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a raid, a hollow, ringing quiet that replaces the hum of activity. As the detectives sifted through the evidence, the malice they found was not the malevolence of a demon, but the complicated, messy reality of human defiance. The Abbey's reputation as a place of hauntings was stripped away, layer by painful layer, to reveal the truth of what was happening within its stone embrace. No one cared about the lady in white when there were ledgers to be read and hidden rooms to be measured. The house itself seemed to recoil from the intrusion, the gargoyles above the entrance staring down with a new kind of intensity. The mystery had been solved, but in its place was a heavy weight of legal scrutiny that would define the property for many years. The ghosts had been evicted by the harsh reality of the law, replaced by the weight of physical evidence. As the sun began to rise over the Sydney skyline, casting a pale, watery light across the Abbey's towers, the neighborhood woke to a different reality. The mansion was no longer a playground for the imagination or a site of harmless folklore. It was a crime scene, a monument to a shadow operation that had operated right under their noses. The stories of ghosts were replaced by the headlines of the morning papers, detailing the secrets found in the cellar and the men who had kept them. The transition from the supernatural to the criminal was complete. The Abbey remained, tall and imposing, but its soul had been altered. The shadows it cast were no longer just the absence of light. They were the remnants of a history that was all too real, all too human, and deeply unsettling. The house was now defined by its truth rather than its legend, a jagged silhouette against the morning sky, guarding secrets that were no longer its own. The morning air in Annandale carried a heavy, salt-tinged dampness that seemed to cling to the rough-hewn sandstone walls of the Abbey. As the forensic teams arrived in the late 1990s, the neighborhood watched from behind lace curtains, their collective breath held in the stillness of the dawn. The grand house, with its jagged Gothic silhouette and its history of whispers, was finally being asked to surrender its darkest truths. We step inside now, leaving the pale light of the street for the swallowing shadows of the foyer. The floorboards here do not just creak. They seem to groan under the weight of an investigation that has been decades in the making. The air grows colder as we move toward the rear of the mansion, where a narrow, unassuming door leads down into the belly of the structure. The basement of the Abbey was never meant for the living. It is a labyrinth of low ceilings and jagged stone, a place where the humid Sydney earth meets the foundation of a dream built in 1881. Here, the hum of the city fades into a rhythmic, pulsing silence, broken only by the muffled footsteps of technicians carrying halogen lamps and sifting screens into the depths. The basement floor was a patchwork of packed earth and uneven stone slabs, some of which had shifted over the last century as the house settled into the ridge above Roselle Bay. In the dim, flickering glow of the portable lights, the dust motes danced like tiny, restless spirits. The lead investigator, a man who had spent 30 years looking for what people tried to hide, knelt on the cold ground. He could smell the iron in the soil and the faint, sweet scent of rot that seemed to seep from the very pores of the masonry. They began by marking out a grid with yellow string, dividing the floor into precise, numbered squares. Every movement was agonizingly slow. This was not a place for shovels or haste. This was a place for the delicate touch of a soft-bristled brush and the patient scrape of a hand trowel. They were looking for anomalies in the soil density, for the subtle shifts in color that tell the story of a hole dug in the middle of the night, many, many years ago. The orange light cast long, dancing shadows against the foundation walls, making the gargoyles above feel as though they were leaning down, watching the desecration of their sanctuary. By the third day of the excavation, the air in the basement had become thick with the smell of disturbed earth. The team had reached a depth of 40 centimeters in the southwestern corner, near the base of the great tower. The soil here was different, darker, more compact. It felt heavy, as if it were saturated with the secrets of the previous century. One technician, a young woman with steady hands, paused when her trowel made a sound that was not the dull thud of stone or the soft slide of dirt. It was a sharp, hollow click. The room went silent. The only sound was the distant, watery drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the upper floors. She leaned closer, her face inches from the floor, and began to blow away the fine silt. A sliver of white emerged from the darkness. It was polished, smooth, and unmistakably ivory in hue. At first, it looked like a root or a discarded fragment of Victorian porcelain, but as she worked the brush with rhythmic, sweeping motions, the shape began to articulate. It was a phalange, a tiny bone from a human hand, reaching up through the dirt as if trying to grasp the light of the 1990s for the very first time. The discovery shifted the energy of the basement instantly. The speculative whispers of the crew were replaced by a heavy, reverent professionalism. They were no longer just digging in a basement, they were unearthing a grave. As the hours stretched into the evening, the team worked by the steady, artificial hum of the generators. They cleared the earth away centimeter by centimeter, revealing the graceful curve of a ribcage, then the long, elegant line of a femur. The remains were lying in a fetal position, tucked tightly against the interior foundation wall. There was no coffin, no shroud, and no sign of a formal burial. This person had been placed here with a desperate, hurried intent. The investigators found traces of fabric, decayed scraps of wool that had once been a dark, midnight blue, clinging to the vertebrae. Beside the skull, which lay tilted as if in a deep, troubled sleep, they found a small, rusted object. It was a key, heavy and ornate, the kind used for the massive oak doors of the abbey itself. The presence of the key suggested a proximity to the house that was both intimate and terrifying. It wasn't just a body buried under a house. It was a resident, perhaps, or a guest who had never been allowed to leave. As the full skeleton was revealed, the forensic pathologist noted the peculiar preservation of the bones. The high lime content in the mortar of the abbey had acted as a primitive preservative, keeping the evidence intact for what appeared to be at least 50 years. This realization sent a shockwave through the Sydney Police Department. They began to look back, past the modern era, into the missing persons files of the 1950s and 1960s. They looked for the names of those who had vanished during the house's time as a divided boarding residence, when the abbey was a maze of transient lives and closed doors. The discovery of a second set of remains, just 2 meters away, confirmed their worst fears. This basement was a ledger of the lost. The second skeleton was smaller, perhaps a teenager, and showed signs of a violent end that the earth had tried to muffle. The cold cases of the mid-20th century, long thought to be buried under the weight of time, were suddenly breathing again. The names of the disappeared began to resurface in the headlines, drifting back into the public consciousness like leaves caught in a winter wind. Families who had long ago stopped waiting for a knock at the door were suddenly called to provide samples of their own histories, hoping for a closure that was as painful as it was necessary. The excavation continued for 3 weeks, a slow-motion dance of science and sorrow. Every bucket of dirt was carried to the surface and sifter through mesh screens, yielding tiny fragments of a life interrupted. A brass button, a single pearl earring, a Victorian penny minted in 1898. These objects were laid out on velvet-lined trays in the temporary lab set up in the abbey's ballroom, looking strangely small in the vast, echoing space. The investigators found themselves reflecting on the nature of the house. John Young had built this place with visions of grandeur and Scottish manor life, but the soil beneath it had become a repository for the things the city wanted to forget. The shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to pull back as the truth was brought into the light, but the house itself remained impassive. The gargoyles on the roof stared out over the harbor, their stone eyes seeing everything and saying nothing. As the final remains were lifted from the ground and placed into white forensic boxes, a strange quiet descended over the site. The basement was empty now, a hollow shell of earth and stone, but the air felt lighter. The weight of the unknown had been replaced by the weight of the known, and while the truth was heavy, it no longer had to be carried in secret. The abbey had surrendered its bones, and in doing so, it had invited the ghosts of the past to finally find their way home, leaving the living to wonder how many more secrets were still tucked beneath the floorboards of the world. The transition from the damp, heavy air of the excavation site to the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the laboratory at Lidcombe felt like stepping between 2 different worlds. In the earth, we were surrounded by the scent of ancient rain and the weight of history pressing down from the city streets above. But here, within the walls of the New South Wales Forensic and Analytical Science Service, the world is reduced to bright white surfaces, the soft hum of ventilation, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of clocks that measure a different kind of time. The remains, once tangled in the roots and soil of the old Sydney house, were no longer just echoes of a tragedy. They were now physical evidence, laid out on stainless steel tables under lights so bright they seemed to strip away the shadows of the past decades. Every fragment, from the smallest sliver of bone to the delicate remnants of clothing, was treated with a quiet, almost reverent precision. The scientists here move with a deliberate slowness, aware that the secrets held within these fragments have waited a lifetime to be told. The first stage of the process was a slow and meticulous cleaning. This was not a task for the impatient. Forensic technicians used soft-bristled brushes and purified water to gently wash away the encrusted layers of Sydney clay that had acted as a shroud for so many years. It was a rhythmic, meditative process. As the dirt dissolved, the true texture of the remains began to emerge. They were aged to a deep, earthy amber, a testament to the decades spent in the darkness beneath the floorboards. Along with the bones, the technicians recovered small, everyday objects that the earth had refused to swallow entirely. There was a single, rusted button from a coat, its intricate pattern still visible under a magnifying glass, and a small, corroded piece of metal that might have once been a key or a piece of jewelry. Each item was photographed, catalogued, and placed into a clear evidence bag, becoming a tangible link between the person who once lived and the silence they left behind. The lab air was thick with the scent of sanitizing alcohol and the faint, metallic tang of the tools, a sharp contrast to the organic decay we had left behind at the house. As the cleaning continued, the focus shifted to the work of the forensic odontologist. In cases where time has worn away the soft features of identity, the teeth often remain as the most durable record of a life. The specialist leaned over the table, his movements shadowed by a large, articulating lamp. He was looking for specific markers, the unique geography of a smile that existed 50 years ago. He noted the presence of old-fashioned mercury fillings and the specific wear patterns that suggested the person's age and habits. These details were then cross-referenced with thousands of digitized dental records, a digital hunt for a needle in a haystack of ghosts. But the search wasn't just digital. It required a deep dive into the physical archives of New South Wales health records from the 1960s and 1970s. In those days, records were kept in yellowed ledgers, written in the elegant, looping cursive of long-retired receptionists. To find a match, investigators had to bridge the gap between the high-tech sensors of today and the paper trails of a vanished era, searching for a name that had been crossed out or forgotten in the march of time. While the dental search hummed in the background, the molecular biologists were beginning the delicate task of DNA extraction. Because the remains were so old, the standard methods of testing were often insufficient. They looked instead for mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, which is far more resilient than the DNA found in the cell's nucleus. They took a tiny sample from the dense core of a long bone, a piece no larger than a grain of rice. This sample was then subjected to a series of chemical washes and thermal cycles, a process designed to amplify the tiny, degraded strands of genetic code until they formed a legible sequence. It is a slow-motion miracle of modern science, watching a profile emerge from a smudge of ancient marrow. The lab technicians spoke in hushed tones, their eyes fixed on the monitors where the peaks and valleys of a genetic map began to take shape. This was the search for a genetic ghost, a signature that could be compared to the DNA of living relatives who might still be searching for answers, perhaps without even knowing that their ancestors were resting beneath a house they passed every day on their way to work. Simultaneously, a team of historical researchers was working in the quiet reading rooms of the State Library and the Land Registry Office. They were tracing the life of the house itself, treating the building as a living witness. They pored over old electoral rolls, matching the names of former residents to the timeline suggested by the forensic evidence. They looked for the gaps in the records, the names that suddenly vanished without a forwarding address or a death certificate. One researcher spent hours tracing the title deeds back to the early 20th century, uncovering a web of short-term rentals and forgotten borders. They found a series of letters from the 1950s, tucked away in an old administrative file, where a neighbor had complained about the strange, reclusive nature of one particular tenant. Each piece of paper was a thread, and as they wove them together, a picture began to emerge. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a map of lives lived in the shadows of the city. They were looking for the intersection where a missing persons report from 1972 met the physical reality of a person found in the foundation of the house in the present day. The final connection came not with a shout, but with a quiet realization. The laboratory results, the dental profiles, and the historical records converged on a single identity. The DNA sequence matched a sample provided by a great-niece living in a quiet suburb of Melbourne. A woman who had grown up hearing stories of an aunt who had simply walked out of her life one summer afternoon and never returned. The dental records, once matched with a dusty file from a clinic in Surrey Hills that had closed its doors in 1984, confirmed the finding with absolute certainty. The remains finally had a name. They were no longer the haunted house bones or the found property of the police department. They belonged to a woman named Dorothy, a daughter, a sister, and a friend who had been missing for over 45 years. As the news was shared among the investigative team, a heavy stillness settled over the lab. The science had done its job, turning the anonymous dust of the past into the recognizable face of a human being. The mystery of who was under the floorboards was solved, but it only opened a deeper, more chilling question. How did Dorothy end up there, and who was the person who ensured she would never be found until the house itself surrendered its secrets? The morning sun stretches long, golden fingers across the narrow streets of Surrey Hills, resting eventually upon the restored facade of the terrace house at 139 Kippax Street. It is a structure that looks, to the casual observer, like any other piece of Victorian history in Sydney. The iron lacework is painted a crisp, clean white, and the sandstone foundation has been scrubbed of the soot and salt that once clung to it like a heavy, gray shroud. But for those who remember the news reports from 2011, this is not just a house. It is a vessel of silence. The resolution of the case, brought about by the painstaking matching of dental profiles and the dry, clinical certainty of laboratory results, finally gave a name to the shadow that had lived here in total isolation. Natalie Jean Wood was no longer a ghost of the neighborhood's imagination. She was a woman whose story had simply stopped, while the world moved on outside her front door for 8 long years. I spoke with Marcus, a restoration expert who spent months within these walls after the property was finally released from the coronial investigation. He speaks in a low, measured tone, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has touched the very bones of the city. He described the process of stripping back the layers of the house as an archaeological dig into loneliness. When they first entered, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant time, a mixture of dust, old paper, and the faint, metallic tang of rusted plumbing. Every time a floorboard was lifted, or a section of lath and plaster was removed, it felt as though the house was exhaling. Marcus told me that the most unsettling part wasn't the darkness, but the stillness. Even the rats had seemingly abandoned the place. He spent hours alone in the upstairs bedroom, the very space where the skeletal remains had been discovered, meticulously sanding the cedar window frames. He said that sometimes the wind would whistle through the gaps in the masonry, and for a split second, it sounded like a soft, rhythmic breathing. The restoration was not merely about aesthetics, it was a physical exorcism. The experts had to peel away decades of floral wallpaper that had bubbled and yellowed, revealing the raw, honest stone beneath. They replaced the wiring that had sparked and hissed in the damp, and they polished the floorboards until they shone like dark honey. In the kitchen, where the silence had been the most profound, they installed modern fixtures of marble and steel. The goal was to create a space for the living, yet the workers often found themselves speaking in whispers. One carpenter mentioned that he felt a peculiar resistance in the air of the hallway, a sense that he was walking through water. It was as if the house, having held a secret for nearly a decade, was reluctant to let go of its identity as a tomb. They found small objects tucked into the crevices of the walls, a rusted key, a button from a wool coat, a faded receipt from 1998. Each item was a tiny anchor to a life that had slowly faded into the background of a bustling metropolis. The current owner, a soft-spoken woman who purchased the terrace several years after the renovation, invited me inside to see how the modern haunting has manifested. She doesn't believe in the sensationalist stories of the past, but she admits that the house has a distinct personality. She describes it as attentive. When she sits in the living room at night, reading by the soft glow of a lamp, she feels a profound sense of peace, yet she is always aware of the corners of the room. She told me that she never feels truly alone, but she doesn't find the presence threatening. Instead, it feels like a lingering echo of the quietude that once defined the space. We sat in the very room where the investigators had once stood with their cameras and evidence bags, and we drank tea as the shadows lengthened across the new oak floors. She pointed out that the house is remarkably quiet, even for this part of Sydney. The thick stone walls seem to swallow the sound of the traffic and the distant hum of the trains, leaving only the soft tick of a clock and the occasional settling of the timber. The question remains, does the resolution of a crime actually end a haunting, or does the haunting simply change its frequency? For the experts and the residents of Kippax Street, the haunting was never about a vengeful spirit or a cinematic specter. It was the haunting of a collective conscience. It was the realization that a neighbor could vanish in plain sight, and that a home could become a hollow space in the middle of a crowded block. Now that the dental records have been filed away and the forensic reports are gathering dust in the archives, the house has been allowed to breathe again. But a building that has held such a singular, lonely truth can never be truly empty. The modern haunting is the memory of that silence. It is the way the light hits the spot on the floor where the bed once sat, and the way the air turns slightly cooler in the hallway during the winter months. It is a haunting of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of a life that was finally found and returned to the light. As I walked away from the house, leaving the white iron lace and the polished stone behind, I felt the weight of the story settle. The laboratory had provided the answers, the dental profiles had provided the name, and the restoration had provided the closure. The Sydney haunted house is no longer a place of fear, but a monument to the importance of being remembered. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. As I stepped away from the looming silhouette of the house on Johnston Street, the air seemed to thicken with the dampness of the evening. The white iron lace, once a symbol of prestige and Victorian elegance, now looked like skeletal fingers clinging to the ancient sandstone. Behind me, the laboratory lay silent, its secrets buried under layers of dust and decades of whispered rumors. I thought of the heavy, polished stone that formed the base of this monument, a building that has survived through over 140 years of Sydney's shifting history. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement, and I felt the presence of the stories we have uncovered tonight settling into the marrow of my bones. Outside, the soft, rhythmic tapping of the rain against the pavement provided a steady pulse to the silence that has reclaimed this grand estate. To understand the weight of this house, we must look back to the year 1881, when John Young first began to breathe life into this Gothic dream. He was a man of vast ambition, an architect who saw in these stones the potential for something eternal. He built it with the hands of craftsmen who knew the language of the earth, using materials salvaged from the grandest structures of the 19th century. Every archway and every gargoyle staring down from the eaves was placed with a deliberate purpose. There are those who say the house was never just a home, but a vessel for something more profound. The Masonic symbols carved into the hidden corners suggest a deeper architecture of the mind, a place where science and mysticism were meant to merge. It was a time of great curiosity, where laboratories were not just for medicine, but for exploring the very boundaries of the human soul. The air in those rooms surely carried the faint, lingering smell of old leather, copper, and forgotten ink. But houses, like people, have their periods of sickness and decline. In the middle of the 20th century, the grandeur began to fail. The rooms were partitioned into 50 separate flats to house the desperate and the lonely. The once grand hallways were narrowed by thin walls, and the sound of 50 different lives hummed through the building like a restless hive in the dead of night. It was during these years that the legends truly took root in the local consciousness. People spoke of footsteps in the hallways and the smell of ozone rising from the basement where the laboratory had once been. The polished stone became stained by soot, and the white iron lace began to rust, flaking off like dead skin. It was no longer a palace of ambition, but a labyrinth of shadows and quiet, muffled voices from the past. The laboratory remains the most persistent ghost of all, a place where the air always feels a few degrees colder than the rest of the house. We can imagine the flickering glow of gaslight against the glass beakers and the heavy copper coils of those early experiments. There are rumors of scientific inquiries that bordered on the grotesque, attempts to capture the essence of life or to communicate with those who had already crossed the veil. Even now, explorers report a strange vibration in the air of the cellar, a low frequency that causes the heart to skip and the skin to prickle with an ancient fear. They say that John Young's ghost still wanders those lower levels, checking the gauges of machines long since hauled away. The laboratory is a reminder that the quest for knowledge can sometimes lead us into places where the light cannot follow. And we cannot ignore the land upon which the house stands, for the soil remembers everything. Just a short distance away lies the infamous stretch known as the Street with No Name, a place where the darkness seems to pool even on the brightest days. It is a site of documented tragedies and unexplained occurrences that defy the logic of the modern world. The violence of that street, the murders and the disappearances that have haunted Annandale for decades, seems to feed into the aura of the house itself. It is as if the ground is saturated with a memory of pain. When the wind howls through the stone viaducts, you can almost hear the echoes of those lost voices carried on the gale. The house stands as a sentinel over this cursed ground, a witness to the dark side of the city and the secrets buried beneath the pavement and flickering shadows. Tonight, as we close the door on the Sydney haunted house, we are left with more questions than answers. Is it the architecture that holds the spirits, or the people who lived within its walls? The history of the house is a tapestry of ambition, curiosity, and the inevitable decay of time. The white iron lace has been restored, gleaming in the moonlight like a ghost of its former self, but the stone remains heavy with the past. The laboratory is quiet, but its influence lingers in the cold drafts of the grand rooms and the way the shadows seem to stretch further than they should. We have walked through the history of a building that refused to be forgotten, a place where the veil between the past and the present is thin enough to touch. The echoes of the laboratory will always remain in the polished stone, a silent monument to the mysteries of the night. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.